And welcome to Chapter 18, Learning Objective 3. In Learning Objective 3, we're going to take a look at the equilibrium in the labor market between the demand and supply. So let's go ahead and just jump right into it if you don't mind. Let me share my screen with you and then do my little find the other screen, which I'm about to do right now. Here we are. Okay, pen color. Let's go with purple, sounds good. Okay, so now that we've discussed the demand in the labor market and we've discussed supply in the labor market, we want to turn our attention toward equilibrium in the labor market. So in this particular scenario, again, we're taking a look and revisiting a few of those concepts that we looked at in Objective 1 and putting them together with Objective 2. Okay. Remember that in looking at the wage in the labor market is really the balance between supply and demand. And remember that the wage in the labor market will equal the marginal product of labor. And we define the marginal product of labor, the value of the marginal product of labor as the output or the quantity that the worker can produce times the price of the product in the market, okay? Price of the product in the market. So productivity has a lot to do with these ideas, okay, as we illustrated in Objective 1. Some of the changes that occur in the supply or demand for labor could be from a change in the equilibrium wage. We're seeing right now that employers, because there is a labor shortage, so to speak, that they are increasing some of those things, the perks, the training, the benefits that go along with it, maybe sign-on bonuses. That's not equilibrium wage. In equilibrium wage, what we're talking about perhaps is a raise in the minimum wage or efficiency wages in a particular market. And again, what we see is when the wages increase, it's going to change the value of the marginal product by the same amount in the longer term. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this graph would look. Again, here's the equilibrium in the wage, the equilibrium in the labor market. So again, along the y-axis, we have the wage and we have the quantity of labor along the x-axis. Remember, the demand is coming from businesses wanting to hire individuals to work in the business. The supply is coming from households, okay? Where these two are equal, where the quantity demanded of labor equals the quantity supplied, that becomes our equilibrium wage rate and our equilibrium employment level. There is a thing called the natural rate of unemployment. And the natural rate of unemployment is around 4%. We're never going to get to zero because if you've taken my macroeconomics, you know that there are three reasons for this that we could never get to zero. And one is there's unions, there are minimum wages, and the third and final reason are efficiency wages, which is where a business would choose to pay higher than the going wage rate, which is what we're seeing in some companies today. So let's talk about an increase in the supply of labor. So basically, what if we have a bunch of people that decided now to enter into the labor market? And again, the supply comes from households. So here we have wages. Again, we have the demand for labor. And I'm going to change up my colors here. We have our supply of labor. Okay. Now, basically, what happens when there's an increase of supply? So what kinds of things could cause an increase of supply? It could be a number of people that are just now entering into the workforce, perhaps a generational thing, although that's not the case presently. It's actually the opposite of that. So let's go ahead and put supply too. And again, these were parallel. I'm still trying to work with my new pen. But basically what this is going to do is you can see if we had our wage equilibrium here to begin with, that our wages would go down in that industry. So basically, we would have a decrease in the wage because of the increase in the supply of labor. Now, the other point to this is we would have a lower marginal product of labor. And when we think about the reason for the lower marginal product of labor, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But again, when we talk about this, the demand for labor with wages going down, because wages have to equal the value of the marginal product of labor, essentially what we get are these two byproducts. Once wages fall, the value of marginal product of labor is going to do the same thing. It's going to fall as well. So we end up overall with higher unemployment. So let's take a look at a much better, much more nicely drawn graph than my own. So basically what we see is a first effect is the increase in the labor supply. Again, this might be that some individuals start to enter in as wages have become higher in the past. Maybe they've went to college, got some different skills to re-enter the workforce. This tends to happen in healthcare. And then what we see is a shifting outward of the supply of labor from here we have the blue supply to the red S2. The second effect is that reduces wages overall because there is a greater number of people in the workforce, and that tends to raise unemployment, raises employment. And so when we look at that, again, it's kind of interesting when we have a shifting outward here. We don't see that a lot because we've had this idea that workers' ages, we don't have the same population entering the workforce that's leaving the workforce. So this tends to be something we're not seeing too often. Some countries have increased their supply of labor a little bit differently, but using, for example, immigration. So again, we think about immigration and we've been on more inward oriented policies as opposed to outward oriented policies since the last administration. But immigration can actually be a way that a country could increase its supply of labor. And again, we're talking about individuals that do in fact have the skills and abilities to automatically work in that particular industry, can shift it out. So when we talk about, and here's a good example, talking about physicians. So there tends to be lower wages in labor markets where new immigrants would seek work. So for example, if new immigrants come in and they seek work in as a physician, then the wages for physicians overall would decrease. So a decrease in the wages, which means a decrease in the value of the marginal product of labor. But what happens is higher wages will happen in other markets where immigrants do not perhaps come into immediately. Because again, we kind of keep keeping with our apple idea here. Maybe physicians buy more apples, let's say, okay, that's true. So then because of the increase in the market price for apples, increase in the price in the marketplace for apples, that means there's going to be a higher demand in the labor market for apples. And so higher wages for apple pickers because the price went up. And we know that when the price goes up, we take the marginal product of labor times the price, and that gives us the wages. So it can also work in the opposite way as well. Again, in terms of an increase in demand, if we have an increase in demand among individuals wanting to hire, which is what we're currently seeing today, again, quantity of labor and wage. If we see the demand curve for labor, the supply curve of labor, I'm going to go ahead and hold the supply curve constant, but now more and more people are demanding labor. And so what we're tending to see is that wage level go from wage 1 to wage 2. Okay. Now, what's interesting is in looking at the increase in demand for labor, that a lot of organizations are getting kind of they're thinking outside the box, which they absolutely should. So in terms of the increase in demand, we're seeing these among more higher skill, higher level to try and get them to come into the labor force. Okay, so let's try our hand at a few of these. So in each of the scenarios, diagram the market for domestic auto workers to find the effects on their wage and employment. So baby boomers who worked in the auto industry retire. So here, think about, first of all, is that demand for labor or supply of labor? And if you answered supply of labor, you're right. So the supply of labor is going to decrease, right? Because we have these trained individuals leaving the workforce, okay? Now let's look at the second one. Car buyers' preferences shift toward imported autos. So think of derived demand now. So that must mean that US or domestic car demand is down. If domestic car demand is down in the US, then derived demand would say the demand for workers in domestic industries is going to be down. So the demand is going to shift inward. Technological progress boosts productivity in the automobile manufacturing industry. So here we're hitting that quantity of output, which we know we take the quantity and multiply it by the price, and that gives us the value of the marginal product of labor, which is the same as wages. So when we think about this one, if productivity goes up, then that must mean the value of the marginal product would go up, which likewise wages would go up. So let's take a look at each of these graphs. A, baby boomers retire. So here we have the market for baby boomers. As they retire, the supply curve is going to shift inward to the left. What's the effect? Driving the wages upward and the quantity of labor downward because we had a retirement. In B, we asked ourselves, okay, now what happens if the demand for US autos decreases? And basically that derived demand. So we see then that the demand for labor among auto workers in the US shifts inward or to the left, driving wages down and the quantity of labor down. The last one that we looked at had to do with quantity and productivity. So if productivity is higher, we know then that that will affect the marginal product of labor. And so the marginal product of labor would increase, driving the derived demand for labor upward, showing that productivity increase. Because remember, the demand here is the value of the marginal product of labor, which is an effect of the marginal product of labor times the price. And the marginal product of labor went up. So our demand curve would shift upward and to the right. The effect would be that wages subsequently increase, labor increases. So all of this derived demand of labor and supply translates into a couple of things. One is in taking a deeper look at this value of the marginal product of labor, we're interested in two things specifically. One is productivity, the second is wages. And so remember that our standard of living depends on our ability to produce both goods and services. In macroeconomics, we say this is the gross domestic product. Wages are linked to productivity. Remember, the value of the marginal product of labor is how we take that quantity that we're producing, the output, multiplying it by the price that we can get for that product in the market. Highly productive workers are highly paid. It's important that we don't put highly paid workers are productive because that actually research doesn't prove that out. Less productive workers are, I like that, less highly paid, are underpaid perhaps. So we want to be careful about the productivity payment linkages that we do in fact say And I would caution a bit in terms of how we're talking about productive workers. I think that it's important here to talk about skills. Okay, so higher skilled workers are more highly paid. Okay, whereas lower skilled workers are not as highly paid. Okay. Again, we do see that workers are better off today than they have been in the past, particularly with a lot of our equal employment laws, which we're going to get into in chapter 19 and 20. Also in terms of health safety standards in the workplace. What's interesting is to take a look at how productivity and real wages have grown since the 1960s and even into today. So we do know that productivity and real wages double about every 35 years. And the next chart, which I find kind of interesting, is if we look at, there is in fact a gap between productivity and compensation. So when we look at this up until about 1979, they were pretty much, sorry about that, they were pretty much the same, pretty much intertwined here, with the light blue being our, I want to look at it a little bit better way. Our light blue being our productivity, I'm sorry, no, being our wages, and our dark blue being our productivity. And you might have heard many people say, well, I have to do more with less. And that's this chart kind of shows that as well, is that gap in terms of what people are making versus how much they're actually contributing. Now, again, this is a graph that looks at that, but we might say that there are some people which are not making as much as they should be in terms of the productivity and how we've explained productivity and the linkage between wages. Another thing which is interesting is this gap, and I'm just asking the question, is this gap because of technological increases? So has technology allowed us to do more with less? And then have we kind of, as demand for labor, have we kind of exploited that? So just a question. Okay, in our last objective for this chapter, let me stop my screen share there. There we go. In our last objective for this chapter, what we're going to do is to take a look at the land and the capital, and to take a look at the demand for land and demand of capital, which is also derived demand as well. So I'll see you back next time.